The dust of dry willow was a living thing in the year 1876. It was the color of old blood and tasted of grit and failure. It coated the tongues of men and livestock, settled in the creases of every bonnet and shirt, and painted a uniform layer of rust over a landscape already parched and weary. The Texas panhandle was in the teeth of a drought so long and mean it had baked the hope out of the soil, leaving behind cracked earth and grass that crackled underfoot like kindling. The wind, when it blew, offered no relief, only the dry, herbal scent of sagebrush and the promise of more dust. Eliza Hart felt the familiar grind of it between her teeth as she guided her wagon down the town's main street. The tiny cloth pouch tucked inside her bodice felt heavy, a small, dense weight against her skin. It held every coin she had earned through a year of sewing dresses for the wives of ranchers and mending shirts for dusty cow hands. It was tax money, the exact amount needed to keep the deed for the small ranch, the property of her father, in her name for another season. Her hands, calloused from both needle and rain, held firm. She was a practical woman, with her father's steady eyes and a quiet resolve that the townsfolk often mistook for shyness. They saw a seamstress, an orphan. They did not see the daughter of a man who taught her that land was not something you owned, but something you belonged to, something you fought for. The town square was more crowded than usual. A low murmur of anticipation hung in the hot, still air. Eliza tied her horse to the hitching rail in front of the general store and saw the reason for the gathering. A makeshift platform had been erected, and on it stood Sheriff McKenna, looking like a man who would rather be anywhere else. Beside him, Deputy Boone leaned against a post, his thumbs hooked in his belt, a lazy smirk on his face that never quite reached his eyes. And then she saw the others. Silas Crowell stood near the steps of the platform, his expensive suit a dark blot against the dusty backdrop. He was a man who consumed things land, cattle, smaller ranches that got in the way of the railroad he was courting. His ambition was as vast and empty as the plains themselves. Not far from him, the Reverend Abner Pike stood with a few of his most devout followers. The Reverend preached a gospel of fire and purity, and he saw sin in every shadow, especially in the independence of a woman living alone on her own land. Eliza's stomach tightened. This was the trinity of power in Dry Willow Crowell's money, Pike's righteousness, and Boone's brute force. They were the architects of the town's fears, and a gathering like this meant they were about to put on a show. Her eyes were drawn to the center of the platform. A man stood there, his hands bound in front of him with iron cuffs. He was Comanche. That much was clear from his high cheekbones, the straight line of his jaw, and the long, dark hair that fell unbound around his shoulders. He wore denim trousers and a worn shirt, the clothes of a hired hand. But he stood with a stillness that was not born of submission. His gaze was level, sweeping over the crowd with a calm, assessing air that seemed to dismiss them all. He was young, perhaps a few years older than her own 21 years, and carried himself with a quiet dignity that the iron on his wrists could not diminish. Sheriff McKenna cleared his throat, unfolding a piece of paper. The crowd fell silent. "This man," the sheriff began, his voice flat, known as Toscate, "is brought before the citizens of Dry Willow. He is accused of the theft of a horse, a bay stallion, from the property of Mr. Silas Crowell." A ripple of whispers went through the crowd. Horse theft was a hanging offense, but there was something else at play here, a tension that went deeper than a stolen horse. Crowell made a show of looking aggrieved, a benevolent man wounded by a savage's betrayal. Eliza looked from Crowell's smooth, satisfied face to the Comanche man's impassive one. She had seen Toscate around town a few times, taking odd jobs, keeping to himself. He was not a man who looked for trouble. "As there is no formal jail in this county to hold him for the circuit judge," the sheriff continued, clearly reading from a script he did not write, "and as Mr. Crowell has graciously suggested a solution that avoids the cost of a trial, a judgment has been made. To repay the value of the horse, this man's labor will be contracted out for a period of 1 year, The funds from this contract will serve as restitution. It was not a sale of a human being, not in name, but Eliza knew the truth of it. It was a way to put a man in chains without a trial, to make a public spectacle of power. It was Crowell showing the whole county what happened to those who did not bend to his will. "The price for the contract is set at $30, the sheriff said, his eyes scanning the crowd without seeing anyone, to cover the value of the animal and the trouble caused. $30. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. The exact amount in the pouch against her chest. The money for her land. The money that stood between her and being forced to sell out, likely to Crowell himself. A heavy silence settled over the square. No one moved. The men shuffled their feet. The women looked away. To bid on the man would be to align with Crowell. To take a Comanche onto your ranch, especially one branded a thief, was to invite trouble. The Reverend Pike began to speak, his voice rising with theatrical fervor. "Behold the wages of sin. The savage knows not the law of God nor man, and so he must be bound by the chains of righteous labor, to learn humility under a firm Christian hand." Crowell allowed himself a small, thin smile. His gaze swept the crowd, daring anyone to challenge him. He was not just getting a year of free labor. He was reinforcing the order of things. His order. Deputy Boone pushed himself off the post, ready to escort the prisoner to whichever of Crowell's men would claim him. But then a voice cut through the silence, clear and steady. "I will pay it." Every head in the square turned. Eliza Hart stood with her chin held high, her hand resting on the small bulge in her bodice. The words had left her before she had fully decided to speak them. But now that they were out, they felt as solid and real as the ground beneath her feet. She thought of her father, of his quiet belief that a person's worth was measured by their actions, not by the color of their skin or the fears of a crowd. Paying this price would mean risking everything, putting the ranch her father had built with his own hands in mortal peril. Not paying it felt like a betrayal of everything he had stood for. She walked forward, her worn boots making soft sounds in the thick dust. The crowd parted for her as if she were a ghost. She did not look at Crowell's stunned expression, nor did she acknowledge the Reverend Pike's sputtering outrage. She walked to the platform and looked up at Sheriff McKenna, whose mouth was hanging slightly open. $30, she said again, her voice stronger now. She pulled the cloth pouch from her dress, the collection of coins warm from her skin. She untied the drawstring and poured the money onto the edge of the platform. The coins clattered, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the dead quiet. "Miss Hart," the sheriff stammered, "this is irregular." "It is a contract for labor." "Sheriff," Eliza said, meeting his gaze directly, "I have work that needs doing on my ranch. The roof on the barn leaks, the well pump is broken, and there are fences to mend. I am paying the debt. The contract will be with me." "An unmarried woman," the Reverend Pike boomed, finding his voice, "taking a heathen into her home. It is an affront to decency. It is an invitation to wickedness." Eliza ignored him. She looked past the sheriff to the man in irons. For the first time, his eyes focused on her, and in their dark depths she saw not gratitude, but a flicker of surprise, of sharp, intelligent curiosity. He was sizing her up, trying to understand the nature of the strange bargain she had just made. Silas Crowell began to laugh, a low, cold sound. Well, let the little seamstress have her farm hand. Let us see how long her tax money lasts when she spends it on charity." He saw this not as a defeat, but as a new opportunity. A woman alone, now with no money and a Comanche on her property. She would fail even faster. The land would be his before the first snow. Sheriff McKenna, looking cornered, sighed and scooped the coins into his hand. He was a man who followed the letter of the law, however twisted it became. A debt had been offered, and a debt had been paid. He nodded to Deputy Boone. "Unlock him." Boone spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, his displeasure obvious. He stomped onto the platform, unlocked the iron cuffs, and let them drop. They hit the wooden planks with a sharp, metallic clack. The sound seemed to hang in the air, a final, definitive note. It was the sound of a closing cell door for some, but for Eliza, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like a beginning. Toscate rubbed his wrists, his eyes never leaving Eliza. He said nothing. He simply stepped down from the platform and stood before her, waiting. A silent question passed between them. "My wagon is over there," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "The work is hard. The pay is room and board, and a small wage when I'm able. You will work as a free man under contract, nothing more." He gave a single curt nod. The walk back to the wagon was a slow torment. The town's silence was now a weapon, a wall of judgment and suspicion. Whispers followed them like flies. Eliza kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, feeling the heat of 100 stares on her back. Toscate walked beside her, his stride measured and even, a silent shadow of a man who seemed utterly unmoved by the opinions of the people who had just moments before sought to own him. As they reached the edge of town, Eliza felt a change in the air. The relentless sun was suddenly hazy, veiled by a sickly yellow light spreading from the western horizon. The wind, which had been a hot whisper all day, began to moan, picking up speed, whipping her skirt around her ankles and stinging her eyes with advanced patrols of sand. A dust storm was coming, a proper Texas gully washer made of earth instead of water. "Get in the wagon," she said, pulling herself up to the seat. "We need to move." He swung himself into the wagon bed with an easy, fluid motion, settling near the back, his gaze fixed on the approaching wall of brown cloud. By the time they cleared the last buildings of Dry Willow, the storm was upon them. The world vanished in a swirling chaos of red dust. The sun was gone. The sky was gone. The road was gone. Visibility shrank to the strained outline of her horse's ears. The wind howled, a physical force that threatened to tear the canvas cover from the wagon. Eliza pulled her scarf up over her nose and mouth, squinting into the blinding fury of the storm. She could feel him behind her, a steady presence in the chaos. They were alone now, cut off from the town, from the judgment, from everything except the wind and the grit and the long, uncertain road ahead. Leaning forward, she urged the horse on, driving them deeper into the heart of the storm, toward the faint, battered outline of the Hart Ranch, a place that was either a sanctuary or a final, failing dream. The dust settled slowly, leaving a fine red powder on every surface inside the small cabin, a gritty film that testified to the storm's passage. Morning came clear and sharp, the air washed clean, and in the stark light, the Hart Ranch looked even more weary than Eliza remembered. It was not a place of bucolic charm, but a testament to a long, slow fight against sun and wind. The barn roof sagged in the middle like a tired old horse, shingles missing in a dozen places. The house, though scrubbed and tidy inside, had a porch that tilted at a weary angle, but it was the fence line that drew the eye. A rambling, broken spine of gray wood posts that leaned in all directions, the wire between them slack and useless. Toscate stood by the corner of the barn, his back to the house, surveying the scene with that same unnerving stillness he had shown on the platform. He had spent the night in the hayloft, a place Eliza had pointed to with a gesture. No words needed after the exhausting battle with the storm. She had laid out a blanket and a canteen of water for him, a silent offering that was neither welcome nor dismissal. It was simply a fact, like the dust. She watched him from the kitchen window as she made coffee. He did not seem to be resting. He was reading the land, his head turning slowly, taking in the dilapidated fences, the tired barn, the silent, rusted mechanism of the well pump. He was not looking at it as a collection of chores, but as a single, broken thing. After a few minutes, he walked not to the barn or the fences, but directly to the well. He placed his hands on the cold iron of the pump handle and tested it. It gave a dry, grating screech and did not move. He knelt, his eyes tracing the pipes down to the cracked wooden platform that covered the shaft. Eliza brought 2 tin cups of coffee out to the porch. She set one down on the railing. "That has been broken since spring," she said, her voice sounding loud in the morning quiet. "I have been hauling water from the creek." He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. He did not take the coffee. He simply rose to his feet and went to the barn. He returned a moment later with a length of rope and a heavy wrench Eliza had not seen in years. Without a word, he began to work, his movements economical and precise. He pried up the rotten boards covering the well, revealing the dark, circular shaft below. She felt a prickle of something she could not name. It was not gratitude. Not yet. It was a kind of grudging respect. He had identified the heart of the problem. Without water, mending fences was pointless. Without water, the ranch was already dead. She went back inside, fried bacon and made a stack of Johnny cakes. She brought a plate out and set it on the porch railing next to the coffee, which was now growing cold. Then she picked up her father's tools and went to help him. They worked all day under the relentless sun. He showed her, with gestures and a few clipped words, how to brace the rope, how to hold the heavy pipe as he worked the wrench below. The work was hard, her muscles screaming in protest, her hands raw. They did not speak of the town, or the auction, or the storm. They spoke of leverage and rust and the weight of iron. By late afternoon, covered in sweat and grime, he had replaced a worn leather gasket and reseated a slipped gear deep within the mechanism. He motioned for her to stand back. He took hold of the long handle with both hands, put his weight into it, and pushed down. There was a groan of metal, a deep sucking sound from the earth. And then another. He pumped again and again, a steady rhythm. A trickle of muddy water sputtered from the spout. Then another, and then, with a great sigh, a gush of clear, cold water poured out, splashing onto the thirsty ground. Eliza gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. It felt like a miracle. The water kept coming, a clean, steady stream that felt like life itself. Toskate let go of the handle and dipped his hands into the flow, washing the grease and rust from them. He looked at the water, then at the parched land around them. And, for the first time, Eliza thought she saw something other than caution in his eyes, a kind of satisfaction. "The land remembers," he said, his voice low and raspy from disuse. "It just waits for the right hands." That evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, they sat on the porch steps, a silent, tired pair. The plate and coffee cup from the morning were gone. He had eaten and drunk while she was not looking. "The agreement," she said, needing to put the shape of their new reality into words, "is for room and board. I have a room in the barn for you. I will set aside $1 a week for your wages. After the harvest, if there is a harvest, I will pay you the balance of what a top hand would earn." He did not look at her, his gaze fixed on the darkening plains. He gave a slow nod. It was enough. The days found a rhythm. They rose before the sun and worked until they could not see their hands in front of their faces. They started on the barn roof. Toskate moved with a fearless confidence on the high beams, ripping out rotten wood while Eliza hauled new shingles up the ladder. It was a partnership forged in sweat and silence. She learned the heft of a hammer, the bite of a saw. He learned the English words for tools and measurements, his pronunciation careful and deliberate. One afternoon, a wagon rumbled up the lane. Eliza's hand went instinctively to the porch post, near where she now kept her father's rifle. But it was only Lars and Ingrid Olsen, their nearest neighbors, a stoic pair of Swedish immigrants whose farm was 5 miles to the east. Ingrid, a woman with a face as kind as it was weathered, carried a heavy sack. "We heard you had a new hand," Lars said, his English thick with the accent of his homeland. He did not look at Toskate, who had stopped his work on the fence line and stood watching, his posture relaxed but ready. "Flour," Ingrid said, pushing the sack into Eliza's hands. "And salt, and some beans for planting. The good Lord does not like to see a field lie fallow." It was an act of quiet rebellion. They would not speak against Crowell or Pike in the town square. But here, on her land, they offered an alliance in the form of sustenance. Eliza felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you, Ingrid. I do not know what to say." "Say nothing," the woman said, patting her arm. "Good neighbors is all the thanks we need." They left as quietly as they had come, leaving behind not just supplies, but a small measure of hope. Not all visitors were so welcome. One morning, Eliza found hoofprints just outside the newly mended section of the western fence. 3 horses. They had not tried to enter. They had just sat there in the dark, watching. A message. She said nothing to Toscate, but that night, she took down the Winchester rifle that had belonged to her father, cleaned and oiled it with methodical care, and hung it on 2 sturdy pegs just inside the front door. It was a statement to any shadow that might be watching from the darkness. The town's judgment followed her on her weekly trips for supplies. Reverend Pike had apparently delivered a blistering sermon on the serpent entering the garden of a lone woman, a thinly veiled attack that left the respectable women of the town averting their eyes when Eliza passed. But there were cracks in the wall of condemnation. Dr. Bradley's son, Tom, a lanky youth of about 17, rode out one Saturday. He was not there to stare. "Miss Hart," he said, tipping his hat. He nodded respectfully toward Toscate, who was splitting logs with a powerful, efficient rhythm. "My father says you have the best well water in the county now." "It works," Eliza said, a little surprised. "I saw him in town that day," Tom said, his voice dropping. It was not right what they did. He looked at Toscate with open admiration. "I was wondering, my father said he used to work as a scout. I would be honored if he would teach me a little about tracking, about reading the land." The request was so earnest, so free of the town's poison, that it caught Eliza off guard. She looked at Toscate. He had stopped his work and was watching the boy with a neutral expression. "That is up to him," Eliza said. "His time is his own after the work is done." Toscate considered the boy for a long moment, then gave another one of his short, decisive nods. Tom beamed, a wide, honest grin that seemed to brighten the whole dusty yard. The evenings were quiet. The physical exhaustion of the day left little energy for conversation. But slowly, a space began to open between them. One night, as she was mending a tear in her dress by the light of a kerosene lamp, she saw him looking at the small, leather-bound Bible on her mantelpiece. "Can you read?" she asked. "Some," he said. She picked it up and opened it to a random page. "My mother taught me from this book. She said words were the only fence that could keep out ignorance." He was silent for a moment. "My people did not have fences like that. We had stories. They kept the memory of who we are. The soldiers burned the stories." It was the most he had ever offered about his past. She saw a flicker of a deep, old pain in his eyes, a loss so profound she could not begin to comprehend it. "My father died last winter," she found herself saying, the words coming out soft and small. "The cold got into his lungs. He built this place with his hands. Sometimes I still think I will see him coming in from the barn." He looked at her, and, for the first time, his gaze was not guarded or assessing. It was a look of shared understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the ghosts they both lived with. He did not offer condolences or empty platitudes. He simply met her sorrow with his own. And, in that shared silence, the first true stone of a foundation was laid between them. The work of their hands was remaking the ranch. But in the quiet moments between the labor, something else was being built, something fragile and unnamed, in the space between two people who had both lost everything and were trying to build it all back. One fence post, one roof shingle, one shared memory at a time. The quietest time on the prairie is the hour before dawn, a deep, breathless hush when the world seems to hold itself still. It was the sound of approaching hoofbeats, muffled by the dust, that broke the silence. It was not a familiar rhythm, not the steady gait of a neighbor's horse. This was a shifty, nervous sound, the sound of multiple riders trying and failing to be stealthy. Eliza was awake instantly, her body tensing before her mind had fully processed the threat. A low growl rumbled from the floor beside her bed, where the stray dog she had taken in now slept. She placed a hand on its head, silencing it. In the barn, she heard a soft thud, a sound she would not have noticed a month ago, but now she knew it was the sound of Toskate dropping from the hayloft to the packed earth below. Silent as a cat, he was aware too. She slid from her bed and moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the curtains. In the gray, pre-dawn light, she saw them, a handful of riders, maybe 5 or 6, sitting their horses just beyond her newly mended fence line. They were dark shapes against the pale eastern sky, and in the hands of 2 of them, she saw the dull orange glow of lit torches. The resinous smell of burning pine drifted on the still air, a scent of menace. She recognized the thick-shouldered shape of Deputy Boone on the lead horse, and beside him, the lanky forms of the Harmon brothers, men who did Crowell's dirtiest work for the price of a few drinks. Her heart did not pound with fear. Instead, a cold, hard anger settled in her stomach. This was her land, her home. She turned from the window, her movements deliberate. She dressed quickly in the dark, pulling on her boots, and then she walked to the front door. Her fingers closed around the smooth, cool wood of the Winchester's stock. The weight of it was familiar, reassuring. When she stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held loosely at her side. The riders stirred, the horses shifted, and one of the Harmon boys let out a nervous laugh that he quickly stifled. The light from their torches danced and flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that made the men look like grotesque phantoms. A figure detached itself from the deeper shadows of the barn and moved to stand at her left, just behind her shoulder. It was Toskate. He was unarmed, his hands hanging loose at his sides, but his presence was more potent than any weapon. He stood as a silent witness, a second point of resolve that the riders had not counted on. "That is far enough, Deputy," Eliza called out, her voice clear and steady. It did not tremble. "You are on private property." Boone nudged his horse forward a few steps, a sneer twisting his lips. "Just a friendly visit. Miss Hart, a civic concern. The good people of Dry Willow are worried about you. A woman, all alone out here." His eyes slid past her to Toskate, and the sneer deepened. "Well, not entirely alone. It seems. My well-being is not your concern," Eliza said, her knuckles white on the rifle. "State your business and then leave." "Our business is morality," one of the Harmon brothers slurred. Emboldened by Boone's presence, "It is not right. You keeping a savage out here. Folks are talking. The Reverend Pike says it is an abomination in the eyes of the Lord." "The Lord does not concern himself with my fence line," Eliza shot back. "And the man who works here is under a legal contract sanctioned by the sheriff. Now get off my land." Boone chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "That is just it. Miss Hart, this land. A woman cannot handle a place like this. It is too much for you. You are making bad decisions. Bringing him here, Crowell would make you a fair offer. A much better life than this." "I am not selling," she said, the words flat and final as stone. "You see," Boone said, turning to his companions, "she is stubborn, needs a little convincing, needs to see how vulnerable she is out here, how quickly things can go wrong." He gave a sharp nod. The rider to his right, one of the men Eliza could not identify in the gloom, drew his arm back and hurled his torch. It spun through the air, a fiery comet, and landed in a patch of dry grass near the corner of the barn. The parched blades caught instantly, a whoosh of orange flame erupting in the darkness. Before Eliza could even raise the rifle, Toskate moved. He was a blur of motion. Grabbing a heavy horse blanket from the porch railing where it had been airing out, he ran to the fire, not with panic, but with a focused intensity, and in 2 powerful, sweeping motions. He smothered the flames, beating them back into the earth. He stamped out the last glowing embers with his boots, leaving behind a blackened, smoking patch of ground. He did it all in the time it took for the riders to let out a hoot of drunken laughter. He straightened up and turned to face them. In the faint, flickering light of the remaining torch, his face was a mask of cold fury. He said nothing, but the promise of violence in his stillness was so absolute that the laughter died in their throats. "That is enough," a new voice boomed from the lane. Sheriff McKenna rode into the torchlight, his face grim. He must have followed them from town. "Boone, what in God's name do you think you are doing?" The deputy's bravado seemed to shrink under the sheriff's gaze. "Just a little scare." "Sheriff," trying to talk some sense into her. "This is not talking sense. This is armed trespass and arson," McKenna said, his voice hard. "I will have your badge for this. Now get these fools off this property before I decide to start arresting people for disturbing the peace." He looked from Boone to the Harmon brothers. "That goes for all of you. Disperse, now." The men grumbled, their pack courage evaporating under the direct challenge of the law. They wheeled their horses around, casting resentful glances back at the small cabin and the two figures standing guard in front of it. They rode off, their threats swallowed by the growing light of dawn. Sheriff McKenna dismounted and walked toward the porch, his footsteps heavy. He looked at the scorched earth, then at Eliza's pale, set face. He sighed, a sound of profound weariness. "Are you all right, Miss Hart?" "We are fine, Sheriff," she said, though a tremor was now working its way through her arms. "A little late. Were you not?" "I came as soon as I heard them riding out," he said, not meeting her eyes. "I am sorry." He waited until the sound of the riders had faded completely. Then he stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "Eliza, there is something you need to know. The situation is worse than you think." She waited, her heart sinking. "I was at the county seat yesterday," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Silas Crowell was there. He made a deal with the tax commissioner. He bought your debt. He owns the note on this land now." The rifle suddenly felt immensely heavy in her hands. She had thought she had a year. She had thought her payment had bought her time. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice hollow. "It means the county is not the one you owe anymore. He is, and he is not as patient. He has set a deadline. If the full amount of the back taxes is not paid by the first snow of winter, he has the legal right to foreclose. He can take everything." The world seemed to tilt under her feet. All her work, all their work. The mended roof, the flowing well, the straight new fences. It could all be for nothing. It was not just a fight against gossip and prejudice anymore. It was a race against the seasons, with a man like Crowell holding all the power. "Thank you for telling me, Sheriff," she managed to say, the words feeling like ash in her mouth. He nodded, looking genuinely troubled. He tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving Eliza and Toscate alone in the cold morning light. The rising sun revealed the ugly black scar on the ground, a reminder of how close they had come to losing it all. Eliza walked back into the cabin and carefully placed the Winchester back on its pegs. She sank into a chair at the small kitchen table, the strength draining out of her. She stared at her hands that were calloused and strong from weeks of labor, and felt a wave of utter helplessness wash over her. It was a clever, cruel trap, and she had walked right into it. Toscate came in a few moments later, closing the door softly behind him. He stood by the hearth, watching her. "This happened because of me," he said. "It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. They came because I am here." She looked up, seeing the conflict in his eyes. It was not guilt, precisely, but a heavy sense of responsibility. He saw himself as the lightning rod that had drawn the strike down upon her. "They came because they are bullies and thieves," she said, her voice fierce. "They came because Crowell wants this land, and he will use any excuse to get it." "I brought the excuse to your door," he countered quietly. "This is not my fight. I can leave. The trouble might leave with me." Eliza looked at him, at his proud, unbent posture, at the quiet strength that had stood with her on the porch, that had faced down fire without flinching. The thought of facing Crowell in the coming winter alone was a cold, desolate thing. Her pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. For the first time, she let her fear and her weariness show in her face. "No," she said, her voice cracking just a little. "If you leave, I will lose. I cannot do this alone." He held her gaze for a long time, the silence stretching between them. In his eyes, she saw a decision being made. He was a man who had been cast out, who had been bought and sold, who had no place to call his own. But here, in this small, battered cabin, someone had not looked away. Someone had stood up for him. And now, she was asking him to stand with her. "Then I will not leave," he said, the words a solemn vow. "This trouble came to your door, but we will face it together." A sense of relief, so profound it almost made her weep, flooded through her. It was not a promise of victory, but it was a promise not to be alone in the fight. That evening, after a long day of reinforcing the very fence the riders had gathered behind, she did not point him toward the barn. Instead, she took a clean blanket and a pillow into the small storage room off the back of the kitchen. It was little more than a closet, with a narrow cot, but it was inside the house. It was warm. It was safe. She set a small lamp on a crate beside the cot. When he came in from washing at the well pump, she simply nodded toward the open door. "It is not much," she said, "but it is better than the hayloft. Safer." He looked from her to the small, clean room. He understood the meaning of the gesture perfectly. It was a wall of suspicion coming down. It was a statement of trust that went far beyond their spoken words. He walked into the room, set his few belongings on the floor, and turned to look at her. "It is enough," he said, and in those two words, the contract between them was rewritten, no longer a matter of debt and labor, but an alliance forged in the face of a common enemy, sealed by the threat of fire and the promise of a coming winter. The first sign of trouble was not a sound, but a stain against the vast, pale blue of the afternoon sky. It was a smudge of greasy black smoke, too dark and thick for a simple grass fire. It billowed upwards from the southeast. In the direction of the Garrett place, Eliza, who had been hammering a loose board on the porch, straightened up and stared, her hands shielding her eyes from the sun. Beside her, in the yard, Toscate had been sharpening an axe blade on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone stopped. He rose to his feet, his eyes fixed on the same ugly pillar of smoke. They did not need to speak. There was a shared urgency, a prairie dweller's instinct that understood the language of smoke and distance. Fire was the great enemy, the unthinking beast that could devour a lifetime of work in a single afternoon. He moved toward the small corral where their horses were kept, and she was right behind him. They saddled the animals with a swift, practiced economy of motion born of their weeks working together. Within minutes they were riding hard, the dry ground thundering under the horses' hooves, the column of smoke growing larger and blacker with every yard they covered. As they topped the last rise before the Garrett homestead, the full horror of the scene lay before them. It was the barn, a structure nearly twice the size of Eliza's, and it was wholly consumed by a roaring inferno. Flames erupted from the hayloft doors and licked through the roof, sending a shower of glowing embers into the wind. A chaotic crowd of neighbors was already there, shouting and running. A disorganized bucket brigade stretched from the Garrett's well, the effort hopelessly futile against the sheer scale of the blaze. The roar of the fire was a physical thing, a deep, guttural sound punctuated by the sharp crack of splitting timbers. Waves of heat washed over them even at a distance. They dismounted and ran toward the chaos. Eliza saw Paul Garrett, his face black with soot, being held back by two other men as he struggled to run toward the burning building. And then Eliza heard the sound that would haunt her dreams, a sound of pure, animal anguish. It was Sarah Garrett, Paul's wife. She was on her knees in the dirt, her hands tearing at her hair, her voice a raw, broken scream. "Rebecca, my baby, she is in there." She was playing with the kittens in the loft. A collective gasp went through the crowd. A wave of horror that silenced all other noise save the fire's roar. Every eye turned to the hayloft, where the open doors now framed a vision of hell. The idea of a child being in that furnace was unthinkable, a nightmare made real. The men holding Paul Garrett tightened their grip as he let out a great, wounded bellow. The bucket brigade faltered, the men and women standing frozen, their faces pale with shock and helplessness. They were farmers and ranchers, brave enough in their own right. But this was a force beyond their control. This was an act of God, and they could only watch in terror. Eliza felt her blood run cold. She looked for the child, a desperate, hopeless scan of the flames, and saw nothing. Her gaze found Toscate. He was not looking at the crowd or at the grieving parents. He was looking at the fire, his face taut with concentration. His eyes narrowed as if he were reading a map. He took in the direction of the wind, the pattern of the flames, the groaning protest of the main support beams. While others were paralyzed by horror, he was calculating. His gaze fell on a large water trough for the livestock, miraculously still full. He moved. There was no hesitation. He grabbed a heavy wool blanket from the back of a nearby wagon, ran to the trough, and plunged it into the water until it was completely saturated. He moved with a speed and purpose that was breathtaking. The crowd, confused by his actions, parted for him. He wrapped the dripping blanket over his head and shoulders, leaving only a small slit for his eyes. Before anyone could shout a warning or try to stop him, he ran. He did not charge blindly, but moved in a low, swift crouch, his path weaving around the worst of the falling embers. He reached the great, yawning doors of the barn and, without breaking stride, plunged into the smoking, fiery maw. He was gone. The crowd stood in stunned silence. A woman screamed. Someone, perhaps Reverend Pike, who had arrived to witness the spectacle, muttered, "Folly. It is the Lord's judgment." Eliza could not breathe. She stood rooted to the spot, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, her eyes glued to the doorway through which he had vanished. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The roof of the barn gave a great, sickening groan. A section near the back collapsed inward, sending a volcano of sparks and smoke into the sky. Hope died. It was impossible. No one could survive in there. Then, just as a collective moan of despair rose from the onlookers, a figure staggered out of the smoke. It was him. The blanket was smoldering. His shirt was scorched, but he was moving. And in his arms, he carried a small, limp form wrapped in a piece of his own torn and wetted shirt. He made it 10 feet from the barn before his legs gave out. He fell to his knees, but with a final, desperate effort, he gently laid the child on a patch of clear ground before collapsing onto his side, coughing violently, his body racked with tremors. The spell of inaction was broken. The crowd surged forward. Sarah Garrett scrambled on her hands and knees to reach her daughter, her cries now a string of desperate prayers. "Rebecca, my sweet baby, Rebecca." "Give her air," a voice of authority commanded. Dr. Bradley pushed his way through the circle of bodies, his medical bag already in hand. He knelt beside the small, still form of Rebecca Garrett. Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes closed. The doctor put his ear to her chest, his face grim. "She is not breathing." He worked quickly, clearing her mouth and tilting her head back. He began to press on her small chest with a firm, rhythmic pressure. The world seemed to stop. Every person held their breath, their collective will focused on that tiny, unmoving child. For a heart-stopping moment. Nothing happened. Then, a small sputter, a weak cough, and then a full, wailing cry. The most beautiful sound any of them had ever heard. A great, ragged cheer went up from the crowd. Sarah Garrett snatched her daughter into her arms, covering her face with kisses, her sobs now of overwhelming relief. Dr. Bradley sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his brow. His eyes found Toskate, who had managed to push himself into a sitting position a few feet away. He was leaning on one arm, his head bowed, his chest heaving as he fought for breath. His own arms were red and angry with burns. The attention of the crowd now shifted. They looked from the crying, living child to the man who had walked through fire to save her. They saw not the silent, menacing savage from the town square, but a man, scorched and exhausted, who had risked everything for a child he did not know. Mrs. Patterson, the town's most relentless gossip, stood with her mouth agape, her face a comical picture of confusion as her simple, ugly certainties crumbled to dust. Paul Garrett, his face streaked with tears and soot, walked over to Toskate. He dropped to one knee in front of him, so they were at eye level. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he simply reached out and placed a trembling hand on Toskate's shoulder, a gesture of profound, unspeakable gratitude. After a moment, he found his voice. He stood up and turned to face his neighbors, his voice ringing with emotion. "This barn is ash," he said, gesturing to the burning ruin, "but we will build a new one. This Saturday, I am calling a barn raising. I am asking for the help of any man who calls himself a neighbor." His eyes swept the crowd and then came to rest, with deliberate weight, on Toskate. He took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was loud and clear, an open confession for all to hear. "And before we raise a single beam, I want to offer my public apology to Toskate Narrow Arrow. I judged you. I spoke against you. I was wrong. You are a better man than I am." A murmur went through the crowd. Men who had stood in judgment now looked down at their feet in shame. Several of them nodded their agreement. Tom Bradley, the doctor's son, stepped forward, his young face shining with undisguised hero worship. "I will be there, Mr. Garrett," he said. "And, if it is all right, Tos, perhaps you could show me how to properly join a crossbeam. My father says no one knows wood better than a Comanche." The open request, the public deference to Toskate's skill, was as significant as the apology. It was an acceptance, an invitation. The walls of prejudice, so solid just an hour before, were beginning to crack. The bucket brigade, which had dissolved in the panic, began to form again. But this time, they worked with a new unity, their movements crisp and efficient. They were no longer trying to save the barn. They were working together to wet down the roof of the Garrett's house. To protect what was left, they passed the buckets from hand to hand down the line. A chain of common effort. It was more than water being passed. It was a current of trust, a shared belief in the possibility of starting over, rising from the ashes of a burned-down building and a burned-down prejudice. The Saturday of the barn raising dawned cool and clear, a mercy after a week of oppressive heat. The Garrett place was a hive of activity, a stark contrast to the smoldering, black skeleton of the old barn. Wagons were drawn up in a loose circle, and the air was filled with the sounds of hammers, saws, and the murmur of quiet conversation. The women had set up long trestle tables near the house, laden with food and buckets of fresh, cool water from the well. The men, stripped to their shirt sleeves, were gathered around neat stacks of fresh-cut pine and oak, the clean, sharp scent of the lumber a hopeful fragrance against the lingering smell of ash. Eliza moved through the controlled chaos of the women's work, stirring a large pot of beans, her hands moving with the familiar rhythms of cooking for a crowd. But her eyes and her thoughts were elsewhere. She watched the men as they began to clear the last of the debris, her gaze constantly finding Toskate. He stood slightly apart from the main group, his arms, now healing from the burns but still showing angry red patches, crossed over his chest. He was not giving orders, not asserting himself, but watching, his eyes taking in the lay of the land, the quality of the timber, the character of the men who had come to help. There was a moment of uncertainty after the ground was cleared. The men stood around, looking at the lumber, each with his own idea of how to begin. Paul Garrett, his face still etched with a grief that would never fully fade, stepped forward. He cleared his throat, and a respectful silence fell over the yard. "Friends," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I thank you all for being here. You know what we lost, but today, we build again." He paused, and then he turned and walked directly to Toscate. "I am a farmer," Paul said, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "I know soil and seed. I do not know how to raise a frame that will stand against a Texas wind for 50 years, but I am told you do." He gestured to the pile of massive oak beams that would form the foundation and main supports. "The heart of the barn. I would be honored if you would lead us in this." A low murmur went through the group of men. It was one thing to be grateful to a man for saving a child. It was another to place the fate of your new barn, the most important building on your farm, in his hands. The Harmon brothers exchanged a look of sullen disbelief, but Lars Olsen, the stoic Swede, gave a decisive nod. "A man who knows wood. Knows wood." He rumbled, "Is good." That simple statement seemed to break the tension. Toscate looked at Paul Garrett, then at the expectant faces of the other men. He gave a single, slow nod. He did not smile or make a speech. He simply walked to the pile of oak beams. He ran his hand over the rough-hewn surface of the largest one, then sighted down its length, checking for warps. He was all business. He motioned to Lars and two other sturdy men, using gestures and a few quiet words. He showed them exactly where to make the cuts for the mortise and tenon joints, a method of joining wood that required no nails and would last a century. Eliza watched, her heart swelling with a strange, fierce pride. He moved with a quiet authority that came not from a loud voice, but from an absolute and certain competence. The men, even the reluctant ones, found themselves falling into his rhythm. Tom Bradley was his shadow, soaking up every detail, his young face a mask of intense concentration. When one of the Harmon brothers made a careless cut, Toscate did not rebuke him. He simply took the piece, examined it, and with a few deft strokes of a chisel, corrected the mistake. The lesson was delivered in silence, and was all the more powerful for it. Eliza served water, her path always seeming to lead her near the rising frame. She watched the muscles in his back and shoulders work as he and three other men hoisted the first massive post into place. She saw the sweat beading on his brow, the intense focus in his eyes. He was not just building a barn. He was weaving a new place for himself into the very fabric of the community, one perfectly joined beam at a time. At midday, the work paused. The men, slick with sweat and sawdust, came to the tables, their faces weary but satisfied. The basic frame of the new barn now stood, a clean, strong skeleton against the sky. As Paul Garrett handed a tin plate of food to Toscate, he raised his cup of water. "A toast," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. The yard fell quiet again. "To strong hands and good neighbors." He paused, his eyes finding Toscate's, "and to our newest neighbor, Toscate Narrow Arrow. Welcome." Almost every man raised his cup. Lars Olsen drank deeply. Tom Bradley grinned. Even the Harmon brothers, after a moment's hesitation, lifted their cups in a grudging, barely perceptible gesture. It was a turning point, a public declaration. The brand of outcast was being washed away by a tide of shared labor and respect. But not everyone was celebrating. On the far edge of the gathering, half hidden by the shadow of a large cottonwood tree, stood Silas Crowell. He was not sweating. His dark suit was immaculate. He was not participating in the work or the meal. He was simply watching, a small leather-bound ledger and a pencil in his hand. His gaze was cold and proprietary, like a man assessing the value of livestock. He was not looking at the barn. He was looking at the people, at the resources, at the alliances being formed. As Eliza watched, he made a neat little notation in his book. His lips curved in a smile that held no warmth at all. A chill went through her, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He was not just an observer. He was a predator, patiently waiting. Beside Crowell, the Reverend Pike was holding court with a small group of women, including Mrs. Patterson. His face was a thundercloud of disapproval, his hands gesturing toward the celebrating men. Eliza could not hear his words, but she could imagine them a sermon on the folly of embracing a sinner, on the dangers of letting a wolf into the flock. The battle for the soul of Dry Willow was not over. It was merely being fought on new ground. Later in the afternoon, during a brief lull, Toscate came to the water barrel to refill a canteen. Eliza was there, rinsing a cloth. For a moment, they were alone in the midst of the crowd. "You are a good foreman," she said softly. He shrugged, the compliment seeming to make him uncomfortable. He looked at the rising barn, then back at her. "It is good wood." He seemed to search for something more to say. He touched the oak post nearest to them. "My people call this tree the strong spine." He tapped his own chest. "This is Numu, the people." He pointed to the ground beneath their feet. "This is Tubutsi, the earth." He spoke the words softly, his language a series of sounds both guttural and gentle. It was a gift, a small piece of his world that he had kept hidden, and he was sharing it with her. Eliza listened, her heart aching with a tenderness she did not understand. She repeated the last word. "Tubutsi." A flicker of something, perhaps surprise or pleasure, showed in his eyes. He gave a slight nod before turning and rejoining the work. They rode home as the sun was setting. The new frame of the garret barn silhouetted against a sky of bruised purple and orange. They were both bone-tired, their bodies aching from the long day. They sat on their own porch steps, the comfortable silence of shared exhaustion between them. But the image of Silas Crowell and his ledger book had been haunting Eliza all day. "He was there," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Crowell. He was watching. He was writing in his book." The peace of the evening shattered. The cold reality of their situation rushed back in, inescapable. She wrapped her arms around herself, a sudden tremor running through her. "He is just waiting for the first snow. Like a vulture. We are working so hard, but it might all be for nothing." Her voice broke on the last word. He was silent for a long time. The crickets began their nightly chorus. He did not offer empty words of hope. He simply sat beside her, his solid presence a comfort in the gathering dark. Then, he reached into a small leather pouch he wore on his belt. He drew something out and held it in his palm. He opened his hand. Lying on his calloused skin was a perfect arrowhead, not of dark flint, but of milky white quartz that seemed to glow in the twilight. It was smooth and cool, beautifully shaped, an object of purpose and grace. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice low and resonant. "It is quartz, the stone of the high places. She gave it to me so I would not forget where I came from." He took her hand, his fingers warm and rough against her skin, and turned it palm up. He gently placed the cool, smooth arrowhead into the center of her palm and closed her fingers around it. The stone felt solid, real, a point of stillness in her swirling fear. "He writes in his book of debt," Toscate said, his eyes meeting hers in the darkness. "His power is in paper and numbers. Our power is here." He pressed her fist gently. "In the Tubutsi, the land knows its own. You hold this so it remembers you belong to it." The arrowhead was more than a gift. It was a promise. It was an anchor. It was a testament that their claim was written not in a ledger book, but in the earth itself, in their sweat and their loyalty and their shared will to endure. Eliza held it tight, the sharp edges pressing into her skin, and for the first time since the sheriff's warning, she felt a flicker not of hope, but of something far stronger, defiance. The steer, a stubborn yearling with more muscle than sense, had chosen the worst possible time and the worst possible place to get itself lost. It had scrambled up into the rocky, broken country of Black Mesa, a vast, flat-topped monolith that loomed over the plains like a sleeping giant. The air had been heavy and still all morning, the sky the color of a day-old bruise, and every rancher in the county knew what that meant. A low-pressure system was settling in, and the weather was about to break. Eliza and Toskate had been tracking the animal for hours, their progress slow and painstaking across the treacherous terrain. He moved with a silent, ground-covering stride, his eyes reading the story of the steer's passage in a way that still felt like magic to her. He would stop, point to a scuffed rock or a broken twig, and she would nod, trying to see what he saw, trying to learn the land's subtle language. They found the steer just after noon, cornered in a box canyon, looking sullen and exhausted. The relief was short-lived. As they were working to rope the animal and lead it out, the first drop of rain fell. A single, fat splat in the dust that was almost instantly followed by a second, and then a third. The wind began to moan, a low, mournful sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "We have to get to higher ground," Toskate said, his voice sharp with an urgency she had never heard before. He abandoned the steer. "Now, Eliza!" The sky opened up. It was not a gentle rain, but a deluge, a solid wall of water that soaked them to the skin in seconds. The dry, thirsty ground could not absorb the sudden flood, and the water began to run in rivulets, then streams, all of it pouring downhill, seeking the lowest point. The arroyo at the mouth of the canyon, which had been a bone-dried channel of sand and rock moments before, began to fill with a muddy, churning froth. They were halfway across when the roar began. It was a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. Toskate grabbed the reins of her horse, pulling it forward. "Hold on!" he yelled over the rising din. The flash flood hit them not as a wave, but as a charging beast of mud, rock, and uprooted mesquite. The water, suddenly waist-deep, was a powerful, irresistible force. Eliza's horse lost its footing on the slick rocks, its legs scrambling for purchase. It let out a terrified whinny as it went down, throwing her from the saddle. The shock of the cold, churning water stole her breath. She was tumbling, pulled under by the current, her lungs burning. Then a hand, strong as iron, clamped onto her arm and hauled her to the surface. It was Toskate. His own horse was gone, swept away by the torrent. He had a hold of her, his face a grim mask of determination, his feet braced against the unseen bottom. He was fighting the current, a single man against the rage of the storm. "The ledge," he shouted, pointing to a dark slash of rock that rose above the floodwaters. It was a desperate, brutal struggle. The water tore at them, trying to rip them apart, to pull them down into the chaos. Eliza felt her strength failing, her limbs growing heavy and numb. But he did not let go. He half carried, half dragged her through the maelstrom, his body a shield against the worst of the current. He shoved her upward onto the narrow stone shelf, then scrambled up behind her just as a massive log, the trunk of an entire tree, roared past the spot where they had been. They lay on the cold, wet rock, gasping for breath, the world a blur of brown water and gray sky. The rain was still falling, driven by a relentless wind that cut through their soaked clothing and chilled them to the bone. Eliza pushed herself up, her body trembling uncontrollably. She looked down at herself. The front of her shirt and bodice had been torn open in the struggle, the fabric ripped away, exposing the pale skin of her shoulder and chest to the biting wind. She tried to cover herself, her fingers clumsy and numb. A violent shiver racked her body, a deep, convulsive tremor she could not stop. The cold was inside her now, a predator sinking its teeth into her very marrow. Toskate saw it. He saw the blue tinge on her lips, the uncontrollable shaking. He had seen men die this way in the high country during winter raids. He moved in front of her, blocking the worst of the wind with his body. "Eliza," he said, his voice low and firm. "Look at me." She raised her head, her teeth chattering. His face was inches from hers. His eyes were dark with a serious, focused light. "I have to get you warm," he said. "You have to trust me." She gave a small, jerky nod, too cold to speak. His movements were swift and purposeful. He stripped off his own shirt, the deerskin worn soft with use. For a moment he stood bare-chested in the lashing rain, his skin slick with water, the lean, hard muscles of his shoulders and back defined and powerful. He did not seem to feel the cold. He worked the buttons of her ruined bodice with surprising dexterity, his fingers brushing against her icy skin. He pulled the wet, torn fabric away, and then, with infinite care, he draped his own warm, dry shirt over her shoulders. He pulled it around her, wrapping her in its embrace. The deerskin was a shock of warmth against her freezing skin. It smelled of him, of leather and sage and the clean scent of the wind. He took her hands, which were stiff and white as marble, and began to rub them vigorously between his own, his palms rough and warm, forcing the blood back into her frozen fingers. "There is a cave," he said, his eyes scanning the rock face above them. "A shallow one. We can get out of the wind." He helped her climb, his hands steady on her waist, guiding her up the slick rock face to a small, dark opening, little more than an overhang. It was not deep, but it was dry, a sanctuary from the storm. They huddled together in the back of the small space, the roar of the floodwaters echoing from the canyon below. He left her for a moment, disappearing into the rain. He returned with a handful of dry twigs and a piece of pine heavy with resin that he had somehow found in a sheltered crevice. With a piece of flint from his pouch and the steel of his knife, he struck a spark. A tiny flame flickered to life, and he nurtured it with the patience of a man who understood the sacredness of fire. He built a small, smokeless blaze that cast a warm, golden glow against the dark rock. He pulled her closer to the fire, turning her so her back was to the flames. He sat behind her, his body a solid wall of warmth, and began to chafe her arms and shoulders, his strong hands working the life back into her limbs. The heat of the fire and the steady pressure of his hands began to penetrate the deep, abiding cold. The violent shivering subsided into a manageable tremor. She leaned back against him, her head resting against his chest. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her back, in the heart of the storm, sheltered by a sliver of rock and a small, defiant fire, wrapped in the warmth of his shirt and his body. Eliza felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost dizzying. She was not his employer. He was not her hired hand. They were just a man and a woman, stripped of all pretense, clinging to each other for survival against a world that had turned wild and violent, and she had never felt safer in her entire life. She drifted into an exhausted sleep, the sound of his heartbeat a steady lullaby against the roar of the storm. She woke to silence. The roar of the flood had subsided to a gentle murmur. The rain had stopped. A sliver of pale morning light crept into the mouth of their small cave. She was warm, wrapped in a blanket she did not remember him having. He must have retrieved it from one of the saddlebags that had washed ashore. She was still wearing his shirt. It was large on her, the soft deerskin falling to her mid-thighs, a comforting weight. She sat up. He was already awake, sitting cross-legged by the entrance of the cave, watching the sunrise paint the wet, clean world in shades of pink and gold. A small pile of smoldering embers was all that was left of their fire. He turned as he heard her stir. A smile touched the corners of his mouth, a rare, startlingly gentle expression that made her heart skip a beat. His eyes, usually so guarded and serious, were full of a soft, teasing light. "Guess that means you are mine now," he said, his voice a low, playful rumble. A hot blush spread from her neck to her cheeks. The words hung in the quiet air between them, simple, direct, and freighted with all the unspoken weight of the night they had just survived. It was not a claim of ownership. It was a statement of fact, a recognition of the new and unbreakable bond that had been forged between them in fire and water. He was telling her that they could not go back to what they were. She looked at him, at his strong, calm face, at the kindness in his eyes, and she knew he was right. She also knew that this bond was not a chain, but a covenant, one that had to be accepted by both sides. "Only if you are mine, too," she whispered, her voice barely audible. His smile widened. He did not need to answer. She saw the answer in the depths of his eyes. He had been a wanderer, a man caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. She had been a woman fighting a lonely battle for a piece of land that was her only connection to her past. But here, on this high, lonely mesa, with the world washed clean around them, they had found their place. They had found it in each other. It was not a promise spoken before a preacher or a judge, but a quiet, solemn agreement made before the ancient, silent witness of the stones. They would stand together, not just as allies, but as two halves of a single, stronger whole. They came down from Black Mesa changed. The quiet companionship that had grown between them during the long days of labor had deepened into something else, a silent, profound understanding that needed no words. They moved in a new orbit around each other, a shared gravity pulling them into alignment. The space between them on the porch in the evenings was smaller. A glance across the dinner table held a new weight. The commitment made in the pale light of dawn had settled over the ranch like a morning mist, subtle but undeniable, altering the landscape of their lives. But the world below the mesa had not changed. If anything, it was growing harder, its lines more sharply defined. When Eliza rode into Dry Willow for supplies the following week, a new energy crackled in the air. It was the hum of speculation. Strangers in city clothes stood on the boardwalk, studying maps and speaking in low, urgent tones. Surveyors' stakes, stark and new, had been driven into the ground on the edge of town, marking a straight, unyielding line that pointed west. The railroad was no longer a rumor. It was a coming reality. The talk in the general store was of nothing else. Land prices were doubling overnight for any plot that lay along the surveyor's path. Silas Crowell, it was said, had been buying up parcels for months, his foresight now looking like genius. He was being hailed as the town's visionary, the man who would pull Dry Willow out of the dust and into the modern age of steam and steel. Eliza felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Progress for Dry Willow meant prosperity for men like Crowell. For her, it meant the land she was fighting for was now more valuable, and therefore more desirable. To the one man who was determined to take it from her, her fears were given a cruel and public shape. Nailed to the rough-hewn plank of the general store's door was a crisp new sheet of paper. It was an official notice, typed and formal, listing properties with delinquent tax debts. Her name was at the top of the list. At the bottom, in stark black ink, it stated that the collection rights for these debts had been legally purchased by Mr. Silas Crowell, and that foreclosure proceedings would commence on any property not paid in full by the 24th of December, Christmas Eve. She stood there, staring at the paper, the murmur of the store behind her fading to a dull roar in her ears. It was a public shaming and a death sentence rolled into one. Every person who entered or left the store would see her failure, her poverty, her name linked with Crowell's. He had made the deadline not just a date, but a holiday, a final, bitter twist of the knife. She turned away from the door, her face a pale, still mask. She gathered her supplies, paid the clerk, and endured the mix of pitying glances and cold shoulders from the other customers. As she was leaving, she saw Reverend Pike across the street, speaking to a small group. He saw her, and his voice rose, carrying across the dusty street with the fervor of a man who believed he was doing God's work. "For the Lord rewards the righteous with prosperity," he declared, his eyes fixed on Eliza. "And the wicked he shall cast out, he shall cleanse the land of the unholy, and deliver it into the hands of the faithful." Eliza loaded her wagon, her movement stiff. The ride home was a blur of dust and despair. When she told Toscate, he listened in his usual impassive way, his gaze fixed on the horizon. But she saw the tightening of the muscles along his jaw, the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He said nothing, but his silence was a shared weight of anger and frustration. The pressure was no longer a distant threat. It was a physical presence, a tightening circle. A few nights later, They were woken by the distressed lowing of their small herd of cattle. They rushed outside with lanterns to find the gate to the bean field swinging open. The wires of the surrounding fence cut clean through. Their 3 cows were contentedly munching on the tender shoots of the pinto beans that were their best hope for a cash crop. It took them the rest of the night to herd the cows back into the corral and repair the fence in the dark. The damage to the crop was not catastrophic, but it was another blow, another act of cowardly aggression designed to wear them down. There was no proof, but they both knew who was behind it. Pike's sermon had given a holy excuse to the petty malice of Crowell's men. The next day, Sheriff McKenna rode out. He did not come as a lawman, but as a worried man caught in a vice. He accepted a cup of coffee but did not dismount, as if to keep the visit unofficial. I saw the notice, he said, his eyes full of a weary sympathy. I am sorry. Eliza, he is doing it all by the book. My hands are tied. Someone cut our fence last night, she said, her voice flat. The book does not say anything about that. I suppose. McKenna's face hardened. If you have proof, I can act, but I know you do not. This is not about proof. This is about power. He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. That is why I am here. Crowell's power in this town rests on him being seen as a respectable man of business. But it all started with a lie. Toscate, who had been standing by the porch, moved closer, his attention absolute. The horse, McKenna said, his eyes meeting Toscate's, the stolen stallion. Boone's testimony was the only thing that made it stick, but Boone is a drunk and a fool. He gets careless when he talks. If you could find some proof, any proof, that the story was a fabrication, it would change things. It would show Crowell for what he is. It would give me something to work with. I cannot investigate him without a cause. But if you brought me evidence of a conspiracy, I would have to listen. He finished his coffee in one gulp and handed the cup back. Be careful, he said, his gaze lingering on Eliza for a moment. He is a snake, and snakes bite hardest when they feel cornered. With a tip of his hat, he was gone. The sheriff's visit left them with a sliver of a chance, but it was a desperate one. How could they prove a lie when the whole town had already accepted it as truth? The weight of it all seemed to settle on Eliza's shoulders, a physical burden that made her bones ache. That night, she sat by the lamp, her sewing lying forgotten in her lap. She opened a small wooden box, a chest of her most private treasures. From it, she took a small, delicate ring. It was a simple gold band with a single, tiny seed pearl, her mother's wedding ring. It was the only piece of jewelry she owned, her last tangible link to the woman she barely remembered. She had always imagined she would wear it on her own wedding day. A foolish, girlish dream that felt like it belonged to another lifetime. She stared at it, the gold gleaming in the lamplight. It had value. Not enough to pay the whole debt, perhaps, but enough to buy more time, enough to show Crowell she would not be broken easily. The thought of selling it was like a blade twisting in her heart. It was a surrender of her past, a sacrifice of memory itself. Toscate came into the room, moving with his usual silence. He saw the ring in her hand, saw the glistening track of a single tear on her cheek. He stopped, his face unreadable in the dim light. It was my mother's, she whispered, not looking at him. It is all I have left of her, but it might be enough. He walked over to the table and stood before her. He reached out, not to take the ring, but to gently close her fingers over it, his hand warm and strong around hers. No, he said, his voice quiet but absolute. She looked up at him, startled. But we have to do something. We have no other way. There is always another way, he said. He has taken your money. He tries to take your land. You will not let him take this. 2, this is a part of who you are, your pride. We will not sell it for his satisfaction. His words, his fierce defense of her dignity, cut through her despair. He was right. Selling the ring would be a victory for Crowell, a spiritual defeat far worse than losing the land. She closed the box and pushed it away. "Then what do we do?" she asked, her voice raw. "We do what we have been doing," he said. "We work, we create. His power is in taking, ours is in making." And in the quiet of the small cabin, with the threat of winter looming, they began to make a plan. They did not have money, but they had assets Crowell could not see on a ledger sheet. They had the pinto beans they had saved. They had the small herd of wild mustangs they had been meaning to round up and break, a project for the spring that now had to become a project for the fall. Young, strong horses would fetch a good price. And then Toscate looked toward the hills, toward the dense stands of pine. "The iron road," he said. "It needs wood. Thousands of trees. For the ties? For the fire in the engine?" Eliza stared at him, a slow, dawning hope lighting her eyes. The railroad, the very instrument of their potential ruin, could be a source of their salvation. It was a hungry beast, and they had something to feed it. It was a bold, defiant idea, to take the weapon of their enemy and turn it into their own tool. The contrast was not lost on her. Crowell's men were laying down a line of cold, hard steel, a straight, unbending scar across the gentle curves of the plains. It was a path that crushed whatever was in its way. Their own fences, the ones they had built together, were made of warm, living wood. They followed the contours of the earth, a gentle embrace meant to protect, not to conquer. Their fight was not just for a piece of property. It was a fight for a way of life, a belief that a home was something you built with your hands and your heart, not something you acquired with a pen and a ledger. The first snowflake was a ghost, a pale, lonely fleck melting against the dark wood of the porch rail. Another followed, then a dozen. Within minutes, the sky had turned a curdled gray, and a wind with the edge of a razor was screaming down from the north. It was not the gentle beginning of a winter fall. It was an assault. The temperature plummeted, and the world dissolved into a churning, horizontal chaos of white. The blizzard hit with the force of a physical blow, a sudden and brutal declaration that the grace period of autumn was over. The cattle, spooked by the sudden pressure drop and the shrieking wind, broke through a section of fence and scattered into the blinding storm, their panicked bellows swallowed by the gale. At almost the same moment, a flicker of unnatural orange light appeared in the maelstrom, a hellish glow coming from the small, sturdy storehouse where they had stored their entire harvest of pinto beans and the cords of pine they had painstakingly cut for the railroad. "No," Eliza breathed, the word a frozen puff of air. It was a two-front war, a perfectly timed attack of nature and malice. To go after the cattle meant abandoning the storehouse. To fight the fire meant leaving the herd to freeze and wander to its death in the whiteout. It was a choice designed to break them. From the swirling snow, two riders appeared, Tom Bradley and Sheriff McKenna. They had seen the smoke from the road, a desperate signal in the blizzard. "Crowell's work," McKenna snarled, his face a mask of grim fury. "He is making his final move." There was no time for deliberation. The decision was instant. A grim triage of survival. The cattle were living things, helpless in the storm. They were the priority. "I will go with you," Toscate said to the sheriff, his voice cutting through the wind's howl. Tom Bradley, his young face pale but determined, nodded his agreement. The three men, heads bowed against the onslaught, rode into the blinding wall of white, vanishing into the storm almost as soon as they had left the yard. Eliza was left with the fire. She stood alone for a moment, a small, solitary figure against the twin furies of the storm and the blaze. Then, from the gloom, other figures emerged, bundled against the cold. It was Ingrid Olsen, Sarah Garrett, and a half-dozen other women from the neighboring ranches, their faces pinched with worry. They had been on their way to town, trying to get ahead of the storm, and had seen the fire. Fear was a cold knot in Eliza's stomach, but the sight of the other women, their faces looking to her, sparked something else. Resolve. She was no longer just a seamstress fighting for her own land. She was the woman who had faced down Boone's riders, The woman whose hired hand had walked through fire. They expected her to lead. The well, she shouted, her voice thin but clear against the wind. Form a line. We are not letting him win. And so began a desperate, heroic battle. A line of women, their skirts whipped by the frozen wind, their faces stung by snow and smoke, passed buckets of water from the pump to the burning storehouse. The water sometimes froze in the buckets before it could be thrown. The blizzard fought them, the wind fanning the flames even as the snow tried to smother them. But they did not stop. It was a fight waged with stubbornness and sheer will, a refusal to be erased, a chain of hands against the combined forces of hatred and the storm. Out in the blinding whiteness, Toscate tracked the scattered herd with an almost supernatural skill. He read the landscape not with his eyes, which were nearly useless in the blizzard, but with a deeper sense of the earth, the way the wind shaped the drifts, the sheltered places where panicked animals would try to hide, with McKenna and Tom providing flank support. They began to push the half-frozen cattle back toward the relative safety of a deep, wooded ravine. They were working in a small clearing, surrounded by snow-laden pines. When the shot rang out, the sound was flat and deadened by the snow. A lead ball whined past Toscate's head, close enough for him to feel its heat, and slammed into the trunk of a pine tree. Deputy Boone stepped out from behind a thicket of firs, a pistol in his hand, his face contorted in a mask of drunken rage and desperation. He must have been waiting for them. "This ends now, savage," Boone snarled, raising the pistol again. Toscate launched himself from his horse, tackling Boone and driving him backward into a deep snowdrift. The gun flew from Boone's hand and was swallowed by the white powder. The fight that followed was not a duel. It was a brutal, primitive struggle for survival in the smothering cold. There were no clean punches, only desperate, clumsy grappling in the deep snow that stole their breath and numbed their limbs. Boone had the advantage in brute size, but Toscate was quicker, stronger in a wiry, economical way, and he was fighting with a cold, clear fury. He twisted out of Boone's grasp, gained his footing, and drove a hard shoulder into the deputy's midsection. Boone staggered backward, his boots slipping on a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. He went down hard, his leg bending at an unnatural angle. A sharp, sickening crack echoed through the silent woods, followed by a scream of pure agony. Boone clutched his knee, his face ashen, his fight instantly extinguished by the blinding pain of a shattered kneecap. Toscate stood over him, his chest heaving, his hands clenched. He could have ended it. He could have left the man to the storm and the wolves, a fitting end for a creature like Boone. But as he looked down at the pathetic, whimpering figure, he saw not an enemy, but a broken tool. He pulled a length of rope from his saddle and, with methodical precision, bound the deputy's hands and feet, then fashioned a crude splint for his ruined leg. Justice was not for him to deliver. When Sheriff McKenna and Tom rode back into the clearing, they found Toscate waiting, his prisoner trussed and silent save for his pained groans. The sheriff wasted no time. He knelt beside Boone in the snow, his face hard as granite. "It is over. Boone, you will talk, or I swear I will leave you right here. Who paid you to burn that storehouse? Who told you to lie about that horse?" Boone, broken by pain and terror, began to sob, and then, in a torrent of blubbering confession, the whole sordid story came out. He admitted Crowell had paid him to frame Toscate for the horse theft, a lie to get him under Crowell's control. He confessed that Crowell had bribed the county tax commissioner to purchase Eliza's debt, a cheap and illegal transaction, and he admitted that Crowell himself had given the order to burn the storehouse that very morning. A final, desperate act to force Eliza to sell before the deadline. By the time the three men returned to the ranch with their prisoner and the last of the cattle, the blizzard had exhausted its initial fury, settling into a steady, heavy snowfall. The storehouse was a blackened, smoldering ruin, but the house and barn were safe. Eliza and the other women, exhausted and coated in a mix of soot and ice, had won their fight. There was no time to rest. Sheriff McKenna, his face alight with a grim and righteous purpose, loaded the injured Boone into a wagon. "Everyone who can ride, follow me to town," he commanded. "The circuit judge is in Dry Willow, stranded by the storm. He is holding court in the only building big enough for everyone seeking shelter, the church." The town church was packed, the pews filled with ranchers and townsfolk who had come in from the blizzard. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool and fear. Reverend Pike was at the pulpit, delivering a sermon on God's wrathful judgment as made manifest in the storm. When the doors at the back of the church burst open, Sheriff McKenna strode down the central aisle, followed by Toscate, Eliza, and a dozen other grim-faced ranchers. They were a vision from the storm itself, covered in snow and soot, their faces set and hard. "This service is concluded, Reverend," McKenna announced, his voice booming through the sudden silence. "This is now a court of law." Before Pike could protest, the sheriff turned to face the stunned congregation. In his hand, he held a signed confession, a document he had forced Boone to write and sign before a witness. He read it aloud, his voice ringing with the authority of the law. He read of the stolen horse that was never stolen, of the bribery, of the conspiracy, of the order to commit arson. With every word, a new wave of shock and outrage rippled through the crowded church. All eyes turned to Silas Crowell, who was sitting in the front pew, his face a mask of disbelief that was quickly curdling into cornered rage, the foundation of his power. His carefully constructed reputation as a man of law and business was being publicly demolished. "Lies," Crowell shouted, leaping to his feet. "The ravings of a crippled fool, coerced by this savage." But no one was listening to him anymore. They were looking at Eliza's soot-stained face, at Toscate's quiet dignity, at Paul Garrett and Lars Olson, who now stood beside the sheriff, a silent wall of support. The town had made its choice. Crowell, seeing the tide turn against him with absolute finality, did the one thing a desperate man does. His hand darted inside his coat, and he pulled out a small, silver-plated derringer. He aimed it not at McKenna, not at Toscate, but at Eliza, the source of all his frustration, the one stubborn woman who had refused to break. It happened in a heartbeat. Toscate moved, not forward, but sideways, placing his body directly in front of hers. There was a pop, a flash of fire. Eliza felt herself thrown backward by the force of Toscate's body hitting hers. She heard him grunt in pain. Before Crowell could fire again, he was overwhelmed. Paul Garrett and Lars Olson slammed into him from both sides, and a half-dozen other men piled on, wrestling the gun from his hand and pinning him to the floor. Eliza scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Tos," she cried, her hands fluttering over him. He was leaning against a pew, his hand clamped to his left shoulder. Blood, dark and stark against his pale shirt, was seeping between his fingers. The bullet had only grazed him, a shallow but painful tear through the flesh. He had taken a bullet for her. Later, after the visiting circuit judge had heard the testimony, after he had looked at Boone's confession and the faces of the assembled community, his verdict was swift and absolute. The foreclosure on the Hart Ranch was declared null and void, the product of a criminal conspiracy. Warrants were issued for the immediate arrest of Silas Crowell and Deputy Boone. Reverend Pike, his face slack with shock, stood alone and ignored at his own pulpit, his words of judgment now ringing hollow and foolish in the silent church. Justice had come to Dry Willow, not in a bolt of lightning from heaven, but carried on the back of a blizzard, delivered by the hands of ordinary people who had finally decided to stand together. The snow from the great blizzard melted as quickly as it had come, washing the soot from the air and the last of the bitterness from the town's heart. The land, saturated by the meltwater, seemed to take a deep, cleansing breath. In the week that followed the judge's verdict, a quiet but profound shift occurred in Dry Willow. The story of the confession in the church, of Crowell's downfall and Toscate's quiet heroism, was told and retold over fence lines and in the general store, solidifying into a new town legend. The next Saturday, a procession of wagons, far larger than the one that had gathered for the Garretts, made its way up the lane to Eliza's ranch. It was another barn raising, but this one felt different. It was not a somber duty born of tragedy, but a joyful, almost festive act of creation. They were not just rebuilding a burned storehouse, they were building a monument to their own resilience. Eliza stood on her porch, her arm in a sling where Dr. Bradley had insisted on binding Toscate's shoulder, a gesture that was as much about public acknowledgement as it was about medical necessity. He stood beside her, his own shoulder neatly bandaged, watching the line of neighbors arrive. He was no longer an object of suspicion, but a man of quiet honor. The work began with a cheerful clamor. Paul Garrett, acting as an informal foreman, directed the men with a booming, good-natured authority, though all deferred to Toscate on questions of structure and joinery. Tom Bradley was, as he had been before, Toscate's apprentice, his youthful energy a constant, positive force. Early in the day, a buggy pulled up, and from it stepped Mrs. Patterson. She approached the porch with a hesitant, almost nervous air, a stark contrast to her usual confident bustle. In her hands, she clutched not a pie or a cake, but a clipboard with a sheet of paper. "Eliza," she said, her voice softer than Eliza had ever heard it. Some of the ladies and I, we felt that since your harvest was affected, we ought to do something." She held out the clipboard. "This is a list of pledges: flour from the Olsons, seed corn from the Garretts, smoked hams from my own larder. Enough to see you through the winter and well into the spring planting." Everyone wanted to help. Eliza looked at the list, at the neat column of names, and felt a lump form in her throat. It was more than charity. It was an apology. It was a formal welcome into the fold. An act of communal grace. She looked at Mrs. Patterson, the woman who had once judged her so harshly, and saw in her eyes a genuine, if flustered, remorse. "Thank you." "Martha," Eliza said, using the woman's first name for the first time. "Thank you all." The day was filled with such moments of quiet reconciliation. As the frame of the new storehouse rose, strong and true, Paul Garrett sought out Toscate. "When we round up the Mustangs this spring," he said, getting straight to the point, "I want you to lead the effort. You will have your pick of the colts to start your own herd, and a share of the profits from the rest. Tom here has already signed on to be your first hand." The offer was a formal recognition of Toscate's skill, a permanent position of respect in the community's economic life. It was a job, a future, a place. Late in the afternoon, Sheriff McKenna arrived, not with his badge polished, but with a sheaf of legal documents under his arm. He sat with Eliza and Toscate at her small kitchen table, the sounds of hammering a cheerful backdrop to their serious work. "This is a partnership agreement," the sheriff explained, laying the papers out. "It states that you, Eliza Hart, and you, Toscate Narrow Arrow, are joint owners of the Hart Arrow brand and all livestock bearing it." He had a pen and an inkwell ready. "It gives you both equal legal standing. It protects you both. After what Crowell tried to do, it is best to leave nothing to chance. Your business should be as strong as your fences." Eliza looked at Toscate across the table. Hart Arrow. The two names joined, made official, bound by law as well as by circumstance and affection. She dipped the pen in the ink and signed her name, her hand steady. Then she passed the pen to him. He took it, and with slow, careful strokes, he wrote his own name beside hers. The letters were angular and unfamiliar, the writing of a man still learning the language, but the signature was firm and clear. He was no longer a hired hand, a nameless wanderer. He was a partner. He was home. That Sunday, an invitation arrived that was, in its own way, the most shocking development of all. It was a note from Reverend Pike, formally inviting them to the weekly church social. The invitation was stiff, reluctant, and clearly written under the pressure of his dwindling congregation. But it was an invitation nonetheless. It was a white flag of surrender from the pulpit. They went. Walking into the church felt strange, but this time no one stared or whispered. They were greeted with quiet nods and warm smiles. The atmosphere was one of gentle healing. During a lull in the quiet conversation, Ingrid Olsen, who rarely spoke in public, stood up. She was a woman whose strength was in her hands, not her words. But when she spoke, her voice was full of a simple, unshakable conviction. "We are a simple people," she began, her gaze sweeping the room before coming to rest on Eliza and Toskate. "Sometimes we forget what is important. We forget that the Bible tells us to judge a tree by its fruit." She looked directly at Reverend Pike, whose face was a study in discomfort. "A person who saves a child from a fire is a good person. A person who protects a neighbor from thieves is a good neighbor. A person who helps to build is a person of this community." She raised her glass of lemonade. "To our neighbors, Eliza and Toskate, we are glad you are here." A chorus of amens and heartfelt agreement filled the small church. It was a new sermon for Dry Willow, one written not in a book of scripture, but in the shared experience of the past few months. Later that evening, as they sat on their porch, the new storehouse a solid, comforting shape in the moonlight, Eliza felt a sense of peace she had not known since she was a little girl. The old, gnawing fear, the constant worry of the lone woman about to be driven from her land, was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet strength, a sense of belonging that was rooted not just in the deed to the property, but in the web of connections that now held her fast. She looked out at the field where they had fought to save their crop. In the pale moonlight, she could see them, the small, delicate white blossoms on the pinto bean plants. The seeds Ingrid had given her so long ago, a simple gift of faith in a time of drought, had taken root. They had survived the cattle, and now they were flowering, a promise of a harvest to come. Toskate, following her gaze, seemed to understand her thoughts. The restlessness that had always shadowed his features, the look of a man forever watching his back trail, had softened. The weary caution in his eyes had been replaced by a calm stillness. He was no longer a ghost caught between the world of his ancestors and the hostile world of the town. He was simply a man, sitting on his own porch, beside his own partner, looking out at his own future. He had stopped wandering. He had finally found his Tibutsi, his earth, and it was right here. Spring came to the high plains not as a gentle guest, but as a quiet conqueror. It waged a slow, patient war against the memory of winter, and it won. The grasses, fed by the deep melt of the blizzard, returned with a fierce, vibrant green. The water from the well, the heart of the ranch, ran clear and cold and sweet. The air itself felt new, washed clean of dust and soot and old sorrows. The world was being remade, and with it, the lives of the people who tended it. There was no talk of a church or a preacher. Their commitment had already been forged in fire and flood, and sealed by a bullet. What they wanted was not a legal sanction, but a human one, a quiet moment to state their promise before the small community that had become their family. They chose a place in the open field, not far from the rows of pinto beans that were now showing the first signs of green life. A great, ancient cottonwood tree stood as a silent, rustling witness. Their friends gathered, not in somber church clothes, but in the simple, clean garments of a Saturday afternoon. The Olsens were there, their faces weathered and kind. Paul and Sarah Garrett stood with little Rebecca, who held a fistful of wildflowers. Dr. Bradley was there, and his son Tom, who had brought his harmonica, and representing the law, not of punishment but of protection, was Sheriff McKenna, his badge glinting in the clear spring sunlight. There was no aisle, no altar. Eliza and Toskate simply stood together before their friends. She wore a simple blue dress she had made herself, the color of the vast Texas sky. He wore a clean shirt and denim trousers, but around his neck was a small, intricately beaded medallion that she had never seen before, a piece of his own heritage brought out for this occasion. Eliza spoke first, her voice clear and steady in the quiet air. She did not look at the crowd, but at him. When I was alone, she said, I thought this land was all I had. I thought my fight was for the dirt and the fences. You taught me that a home is not a place you own, but a place you build with someone. My home is with you. Then he spoke, his voice low but carrying, its cadence different from the English the others were used to. I was a man with no tubotsi, no earth to stand on. I walked between worlds, belonging to none. You gave me a place to put my feet. You gave me a place to put my heart. He reached into the small pouch at his belt and took out a single, perfect eagle feather, its edges tipped with white. He gently tucked it into her hair. Where the eagle flies is home. He said, You are my home. Sheriff McKenna stepped forward, holding not a book, but the partnership agreement they had signed. I am not a man of the cloth, he said, his voice gruff with emotion. But I am a man of the law, and I have seen a justice here that no court could order, by the power vested in me by this community, and by the simple truth of what we have all seen. I declare this union to be as true and as strong as any I have ever known. Paul Garrett raised a tin cup of cool well water. To the Hard Arrow Ranch he boomed. May its fences be strong, its herd plentiful, and its house always full of good neighbors. A chorus of amens and heartfelt congratulations followed. And then Tom Bradley put the harmonica to his lips. A simple, sweet melody drifted on the spring breeze, a tune of hope and quiet joy, a song for a new beginning. That night, after the last of their friends had departed, a profound and peaceful quiet settled over the ranch. The moon rose, a silver coin in a sky full of stars. They sat together on the porch steps, not speaking, simply sharing the silence, their shoulders touching. The world felt right, settled in its proper place. After a while, Eliza smiled, a slow, private smile in the darkness. She reached out and playfully tugged on the sleeve of his shirt, the soft deerskin that had once been her only warmth on a cold, lonely mesa. The gesture was light, intimate, a comfortable claim. He turned to her, and in the pale moonlight she saw that rare, gentle smile touch his lips again. His eyes, so often serious and watchful, were now soft and full of a deep, abiding warmth. He leaned in close, his voice a low, contented rumble, echoing the words he had spoken in another lifetime, on another morning after another storm. Guess that means you are mine now. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full to bursting. She looked out at their land, at the dark, solid shapes of the barn and the storehouse they had built together, at the vast, starry sky that stretched out forever above them. She was not a possession. She was a partner. She was a choice. And I choose you, she whispered, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable certainty. Forever. The seasons that followed settled into a new and prosperous rhythm. The Heart Arrow herd, a mix of sturdy ranch cattle and spirited mustangs, grew and thrived, their unique brand becoming a mark of quality and resilience. The railroad arrived, its whistle a lonely cry in the distance, a sound not of threat, but of connection to a wider world. It brought new people, new opportunities, and the town of Dry Willow began to grow. But the growth was different now, tempered by the memory of the man who had tried to own it all and failed. Eliza, true to the memory of her mother, cleared out the front room of the cabin and turned it into a small schoolhouse. Every morning, a handful of children would arrive, a motley collection of the Olsons' blonde-haired boys, the Garrett's dark-eyed girl, and even a few shy children from a peaceful Comanche camp that had settled in the low hills to the south. She taught them their letters and their numbers, but more than that, she taught them that a community was a thing you built, a garden you tended, just like the rows of beans in her field. Sometimes, in the late afternoon, Toscate would stand at the edge of the yard, watching through the open doorway as she stood before the chalkboard. He would see the look of concentration on the children's faces, the easy kindness in her posture, and he would know that this, too, was a harvest. They were not just raising horses and beans. They were raising a future. The land, as he had once said, remembered the hands that knew how to care for it. And under the wide Texas sky, their hands, now joined, were tending a piece of it, making it bloom, ensuring that it would always belong not to the powerful, but to the good. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and press the hype button to help more people hear this tale.